that particular. I speak another language. Translate. Regional meeting for Africa Middle East. Just for protocol purposes, Ariel was before all the POCs had engaged in the morning. We also had a time conflict takes out of development. That instead of us developing, you can live at your pleasure. Brief is how do we strengthen OGP resiliency? Further ado, and maybe this could be the interaction piece, is
just to know them. That's I may have to leave that.
De la fonction publique, travail de la protection sociale du Burkina Faso.
Good afternoon, Your Excellency.
Bonjour, c'est Dr. Good afternoon. My name is Anwar bin Youssef. I'm the ambassador of Tunisia to the...
Thank you, and I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Conflict is consuming us. How do you explain heads of state on two important regional blocs, the East African Community and SADC, sitting until midnight, not to plan budgets, not to plan how to enhance free trade in the two economic regional blocs, not to plan how the Africa continental free trade will move, but sitting until midnight to try and resolve conflict. So, as we speak about open government again, we then need to ponder what more can be done within the framework of this conversation, so that we spend time and resources doing the right things, doing the more practical things for the better. And I'm not saying abating conflict is a bad thing. No, it's a good thing. But should we have been there in the first place? That's the question. Should we be putting ourselves, when we look at the Horn of Africa, the challenges, I don't have to, it's in the public domain, we are all seeing the conflict around us. The same holds for even other areas. We know the disruptions of the war in Europe and the war in the Middle East and the impact it's having on our economies. Supply chains have been disrupted and so forth. We also know that policies in the international arena are completely being overhauled. In loose terms, I would say that there's an earthquake that has taken place, and the tremors are beginning to go far and wide in all this. But open government will enable us to share experiences. Open government will help us to put more pressure on the leadership in our countries and our societies, so that they can hopefully be better as we move forward. Now, one of the things that we have scoped and mapped out is that to effect a robust reform agenda, each ministry was asked to give its priorities, especially the legislative agenda. And we have a record of over 700 pieces of legislation that require either amendment or require fresh legislation. 700. That means even if you have the most efficient parliament or county assembly, you have to figure out how fast or how long it would take for them to do 700 pieces of legislation. And we have seen situations where if you have not had public participation, that legislation is declared unconstitutional and it's thrown out by our courts, and it has happened. Okay, so we have learned the bitter way through practical motions and examples. So everybody now must make sure that you're doing public participation. Otherwise, the courts will declare that law unconstitutional until you have gone through that motion. But here is the catch. We also asked the ministries, just give us an estimate. What would it cost you to go through the process and have your public participation? Because the government itself, the originating ministry or department, is required to undertake public participation, whether it is stakeholder engagement or whatever it is, whatever semantics you may use, but it is public participation, perhaps to develop the policy. Then you go through public participation to develop the piece of legislation. Then you submit it to Parliament, and Parliament again is mandated but also obligated to do public participation. Then after you've done the piece of legislation, there are statutory instruments, that is the subsidiary legislation. Then to do the subsidiary legislation, you must again do public participation. So I told them, just tell us, what do you think it would cost? According to this, by rule of thumb, the lowest process that came up was it would cost 10 million shillings to go through a public participation. There are others, some kind of bills whose nature requires you to do even more in terms of public participation. And the departments were giving us figures of 50 million to 100 million to go through the full hog. Ladies and gentlemen, 700 pieces of legislation multiplied by 10 million alone at the lowest is about 7 billion shillings. I know democracy is expensive and it's the best mode, but you tell me, if public participation is going to cost a government at the lowest something like 7 billion, how do you reconcile this between doing public participation and supplying drugs in a hospital? How do you reconcile this between building a bridge or a hospital and doing public participation? So in the whole framework of open government, we are now faced with a situation where the principle is correct, but did we factor in the cost? So our constitution has now saddled us with a process. But who pays? It's the taxpayer. It's the ordinary citizen. The person who needs the road, the person who needs the medicine in hospital, instead of getting the medicine in hospital, is getting politicians in their village who are doing public participation. So, perhaps in this conversation, we now need to reopen a debate here, a broader debate, that in the whole philosophy, particularly in the context of Kenya, should we develop a rational ceiling? Do we have some parameters that can now be properly built into a piece of legislation so that we don't spend taxpayers' money talking as opposed to delivering service? Yet we must also make sure that they are part of what we are doing.